picture on the walls. I am the shield that guards from the realm of men.
Hello and welcome to another marvelous video. I'm your host Will. George Martin's world building of Westeros is vast and detailed. There's so many fun facts about it, but there's one aspect about Westeros that I don't think gets a lot of attention. In this video, we're gonna go over the facts about the old gods. Let's get to it. Game of Thrones fans are way too familiar with the oath by the old gods and the new. People utter this phrase during several instances where the characters made some powerful vows. Now, it's clear from the phrase that Martin is referring to two major religions of Westeros, and their name alone suggests that the old gods are somehow ancient forces, while the new gods are the faith of the seven. But who are the old gods? And why were the new ones brought in? In today's video, we will look at the complete history of the old gods in the Westerosi continent and what they actually meant. Let's start. The old gods are nameless and faceless deities, which basically gives them an omnipresent character. And during the events of Game of Thrones, they were primarily worshipped by the free folk who lived beyond the wall and some northern houses. That means they believe that everything embodied the power of the old gods. Streams, rocks, birds, beasts, you name it, the free folk will attribute it to their religion. But there was one thing which got priority in this religion, and that was trees, particularly weirwood trees. Remember the tree with the red 5-pointed leaves in the show? Yeah, that was a weirwood tree. It was known for having smooth bark and wide trunks. Most weirwood trees had faces carved into their trunks, and in some cases, the sap was collected in the crevices of the carved places, which gave the trees red eyes, dripping with sap as if they were weeping. It was said that a weirwood tree could live forever if undisturbed. Now, these trees were the most sacred piece of nature for the worshippers of old gods, and they believed that no man could lie in front of a heart tree, and as such, any oath was taken either before the tree or by placing a hand in the mouth of the weirwood tree's face. I'll tell you more about a heart tree in due time. Mostly, weirwood trees were used as heart trees, but sometimes other trees did the job too if a weirwood was not available. But who did these little craft projects on the trees? Well, that's when we have to go back in time to the rise of the old gods. In the dawn of age, or the dawn of days, most of Martin's world was inhabited by a mysterious non-human race known as the Children of the Forest. No, they weren't childlike, but they were smaller than humans. The author described them as having nutty brown skin with some spots, and their hands had only 3 fingers and a thumb. It also had sharp black claws instead of nails, and the children had large ears that could hear things no human could. They usually had large green and gold eyes, slitted like that of a cat, which helped them to see in dark places. It's clear that Martin was trying to establish the children as some kind of near animalistic race that did not evolve into the stage of human beings and retained features that made them suitable to survive in the wild. Their characteristics also suggest that the children had been intricately tied to nature, which kind of explains why they treated all the natural elements as something divine. They were known for being quick and graceful, and often sang in their own language, known as the true tongue. However, by no means were they brutish, because they could wear leaves and flowers into their hair and wear cloaks made out of leaves. It is these residents of Westeros who brought the religion of the old gods and were devoted to them. When a child was born with mossy green or blood red eyes, it was a sign that they had been chosen by the old gods. Those chosen ones were robust and had the gift of green sight, but sadly did not live long. However, they believed that when chosen children died, they got bound to a weirwood and lived longer than any other child. We see the Children of the Forest in Game of Thrones, when Bran was attacked by some White Walkers, and the TV show invented the story that the first White Walkers were created by them to use as a magical weapon during the war against the First Men. I'll tell you about the First Men, but let me explain what green seers are. So the children who got the green sight and the wise men in the religion of the old gods had the rare magical power to perceive past, present, and future events as well. They were considered to be the wise men and spiritual leaders of the Children of the Forest. Some of them could also merge their consciousness into animals, birds, and the network of weirwood trees, becoming wargs. Yes, that's what Bran was. And there was a moment in A Storm of Swords where Jon Snow thought that his direwolf, Ghost, belonged to the old gods given his white fur and crimson eyes. Anyway, it was these Children of the Forest who carved the weirwood trees and believed that the old gods watched through these trees. They also believed that the old gods were speaking back to them through the rustle of leaves and the winds. According to Jojen Reed, who had green sight and was portrayed by Thomas Brodie Sangster in the series, the singers of the children believe that the weirwood trees are the gods, and that when they die, they become part of the godhood. However, the peaceful life of the children were turned upside down when the first men arrived from Essos via the Arm of Dorne. See, Westeros had 3 main ethnic groups from whom the humans descended, and that's exactly why the king who sat on the Iron Throne claimed the title King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. They were the First Men, the Andals and the Rhoynar, and the First Men, true to their name, were the first group of humans to have set foot on the continent. Now the First Men had their own sect of religion like the Lady of the Waves and the Lord of the Skies. The Ironborn's drowned god was also one of the sea faiths of the First Men that survived on the Iron Islands, in the home of Theon Greyjoy. That's why when he was in one of the darkest moments of his life, he found himself praying beneath a heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood. Initially, the children welcomed the newcomers, and the First Men spread over the village and built their holdfasts. However, believing that the Greenseers could see through the eyes of the weirwood trees, they mercilessly cut them down, and this infuriated the children. They declared war on the First Men, which was practically a religious war. The two races fought for hundreds or thousands of years, and the wood dancers were the hunters of the children. It was also said that they turned their trees into warriors, and the Greenseers called upon various beasts of nature to fight for them, which included lions, direwolves, mammoths, serpents, eagles, snow bears, and even giants. The children would rely on primitive tools like wood, bone, or dragon glass, but the First Men were both bigger and had access to better armaments, like bronze swords, armors, and even horses. Yet the children were struggling to win the war, and according to historical records, the Greenseers gathered at Moat Cailin, or the Isle of Faces, and used magic to call the Hammer of the Waters upon the Arm of Dorne. It resulted in the breaking of the land bridge into the stepstones and broken arm, while other accounts state that it caused the Summer Sea to flood into and join the Narrow Sea. However, even the hammer could not stop the war, because the First Men had a numerical majority. Ultimately, after generations of fighting, the two parties came to a standstill and agreed to a truce, which would be famously known as the Pact. So the Pact was an agreement of peaceful coexistence and was entered into by the wood dancers and the Greenseers of the Children of the Forest and the heroes and chiefs of the First Men. It reportedly took place on a small island in the middle of a large lake known as the God's Eye, and according to this treaty, the children retained the rights to the standing forests, while the First Men were allowed to settle in the open lands like the high plains, coastland, meadows, mountains, and such. But the condition was that they would not cut down any more weirwood trees. In order to seal the agreement, faces were carved on all the trees of God's Eye to allow the old gods to bear witness to the pact, and that's how the place came to be known as the Isle of Faces. And a sacred order was established to keep an eye out over the Isle of Faces. This order was known as the Order of the Green Men, who, according to some nursery rhymes, were horned humanoid creatures with horns and dark green skin. You remember catching a glimpse of that weird thing in the first episode of House of the Dragon Season 3? Yeah, this one. If I'm not mistaken, that was a green man. The signing of the pact marked the completion of the Dawn Age and started the Age of the Heroes, which saw 4,000 years of friendship between the children and the First Men. In the aftermath of the truce, the First Men adopted the old gods of the children, and together they even fought the others, aka the White Walkers from the land of Always Winter during the Long Night, and eventually realized that dragon glass was the weapon to keep the others in check, and it was after this event that the wall was said to have been built. However, the pact between the children and the First Men ended with the arrival of the Andals. The Andals, known for being tall and fair-haired warriors carrying steel weapons, arrived in Westeros from Essos some 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, while some historians claim it was only about 2,000 years ago. The Andal invaders destroyed any small kingdoms of the First Men and pushed the Children of the Forest back to the north. Sometime, the takeover was peaceful through intermarriage between the Andals and the First Men as a result. Their bloodline flowed through almost all Westerosi noble houses. So we got yet another group of humans, which means a new religion couldn't be far away. And it wasn't. The Andals would often paint their bodies with a 7-pointed star of their gods, and it was their religion, which came to be known as the Faith of Seven. The gods of this faith came to be known as the New Gods and were worshipped throughout Westeros. The seven did not refer to 7 different gods, but meant the 7 faces of one god, and that's how the religion becomes quite similar to Catholicism and other sects of Christianity that believe in the Holy Trinity. Each face represented a different side of a pious life for the worshippers, and they were the father, the mother, the warrior, the maiden, the smith, the crone, and the stranger. In some ways, the rise of the Faith of Seven can be seen as the emergence of organized religion and one that marks evolution and civilization among men. It also had gospels like the Bible, as in the main text of the seven known as the seven-pointed star. Moreover, this religion was intricately related to the royals and had the High Sept or Great Sept of Baelor, which was basically the Vatican of the faith. After the faith of seven found its way into Westeros, the only places with few followers of the new gods were the north and Iron Island. When the Andals conquered the south of Westeros, they looked at the old gods as similar to demons, and thus destroyed the Great White Trees. Consequently, almost all the weirwood trees were cut down in the south, and the worship of the old gods became an exception except in the places I mentioned, and by the free folk living beyond the wall. Soon, the old gods and the new gods became two opposing segments of religion, and before I go into the recent history of the old gods, let's check out how the worshippers practiced this religion. The way the old gods were worshipped was very different from every other faith in Westeros. For starters, it was not an organized hierarchical religion, because there were no priests telling them what to do and what not to do, holy books to follow, or even temples to go to. The old gods did not even have specific songs of worship, and it was a simple religion in every sense of the term. No grand ceremonies or sermons, no elaborate rituals. Instead, it was followed as a folk religion that survived in the hearts of the worshippers and was passed down from parent to child through word of mouth, who passed it down to the next generation. The old gods had nothing to do with uptight religious laws or written codes and were all about respecting traditions. The followers simply believed that the old gods were constantly watching over them through these faces they carved in the weirwood trees. And so, whenever someone wanted to pray, they did not have to chant or recite verses. Rather, they just stood before a heart tree in complete silence, since they believed the old gods could already hear every word and thought in their minds. In fact, if you think about it, this is exactly why Ned Stark would often visit Winterfell's Godswood whenever he was in need of peace and had to make some important decisions, because somewhere, even he felt the eternal presence and power of the old gods. But hey, just because it was a tolerant religion did not automatically translate to lawlessness. Sure, there weren't any sacred texts, as I said, but the old gods had a very clear sense of jurisdiction as to what counted as crimes against them. And thus, things like kingslaying, slavery, or forbidden relationships were considered to be a sin. However, when it came to killing a family member, the laws were tweaked a little, and the circumstances under which one performed such a deed were taken into account. Moreover, the degree of kinship also mattered. For example, according to the religion of the old gods, murdering a close relative in cold blood was way worse than killing a distant cousin on a battlefield. Next up, we have the guest rites, or hospitality, which was treated as one of the most sacred customs in all of Westeros. According to this, once someone had shared your food and salt under your roof, they were to be offered your protection, and breaking such a holy bond was dishonorable enough to anger the old gods themselves. We have an amazing example of this, and it's none other than the infamous Red Wedding, because the horrific massacre was no longer a political betrayal when the Starks went in as the Frey's guests. It was seen as a blasphemous act by the old gods, and many fans believe that the direct earthly consequence was the birth of Lady Stoneheart, aka a resurrected Catelyn Stark, who only sought vengeance. Yet another consequence that book readers considered to be related to the old gods' fury after the Red Wedding was Lord Wyman Manderly's gruesome revenge against the Freys because they killed his son, Sir Wendell Manderly. When the Freys came to White Harbor, he killed them and baked them into 3 meat pies, which he fed to the Bolton and Frey supporters at Winterfell. This was such a mic drop moment, I swear to God. That reminds me that I've been sneaking in the word Godswood without actually explaining it. A Godswood was generally a small wooded area within the castle walls throughout the Seven Kingdoms and was used as the primary place of worship of the old gods. They were first created when the first men took up the religion of the old gods, where a single weirwood tree with a carved face was planted, and this tree was the Heart Tree. So you get the cycle now, right? Those who belonged to the families of the old gods' worshippers, but later converted to the faith of the Seven, still had a Godswood in their places, which was treated as a private wooded area. According to Catelyn Stark, here every castle had its Godswood, and every Godswood had its Heart Tree, and every Heart Tree its face. The preachers of the old gods considered the Godswood to be sacrosanct, and bringing animals or horses into that region was considered to be a profanity. Interestingly, during the events of Game of Thrones, the religion was not seen as peaceful as it apparently always appeared. There were claims that the children of the forest allegedly practiced blood sacrifices, and that the bodies, or sometimes even the internal organs of executed criminals and traitors, would be hung from the branches of weirwood trees as offerings. However, By the time we reached the main story, all these reported rituals had gone extinct, and only silent prayers underneath the heart trees remained. There are two other customs in the religion of the old gods that deserves to be mentioned, which are weddings and funerals. Weddings reflected the minimalism of the faith, as there were no priests or elaborate ceremonies. The couple simply met before the heart tree while the bride's father, or whoever represented her family, escorted her to the groom, and after a short exchange to confirm their identities, the bride accepted the marriage by saying, "I take this man." The two would then join hands, kneel before the heart tree in silence, and when they rose again, the groom removed the bride's maiden cloak and replaced it with the cloak of his own house. Then, in the end, the groom would lift his new wife into his arms and carry her off to the wedding feast in true Westerosi fashion. And it was traditionally followed by the highly controversial bedding ceremony. Talking of the bedding ceremony, there was another pretty nasty custom in Westeros which was outlawed by King Jaehaerys Targaryen, and thankfully so. It was the practice of the first night, which allowed a lord or nobles to sleep with a newly married wife before the husband. This happened every time the small folk married and was believed to have been started by the first men. Yet there were whispers that in remote corners of the north, where the old gods were still worshipped, some lords continued this custom secretly. Last but not least, we have funeral customs in the old gods' religion. Though Martin never fully explained a formal ceremony for a death for the followers of the old gods, we do know that the great northern houses buried their dead beneath their ancestral castles. The crypts of Winterfell, where all Stark family members were entombed and had their stone statues, yeah, it's believed to have been rooted in the funeral practices of the old gods' followers, especially because of the stone direwolves in the crypt. The Boltons too followed a similar tradition beneath the Dreadfort. Since the old gods continued to survive, it proved that some traditions were too ancient to be erased. But of course, there have been attempts. Centuries before the events of Game of Thrones, Humphrey Teague, the king of the rivers and the hills, tried to suppress the worship of the old gods in the Riverlands, but his efforts ultimately failed, and House Teague itself lost control of the Riverlands. Oops. And then, in the aftermath of the Hour of the Wolf, hundreds of northern men chose to remain in the south, and many of them married the widows of men who had died during the war. Thus, with them, the worship of the old gods returned to many places where it had faded. And the biggest incidence of the faith in weirwood trees among the Northerners was when Bran Stark prayed beneath a heart tree for Robb's success in the war, despite Osha's reminder that the old gods now only had power in the north. We even had Sansa Stark praying both in the Red Keep's Godswood and in its sept, while she was living in King's Landing and was surrounded by the faith of the Seven. It was a subtle moment which screamed that despite everything that was happening around her, she was still a Northerner in heart and soul. And as it so happened, belief in the old gods was not restricted to those who were raised within the bounds of the religion, because we had Samwell Tarly choosing to swear his vows to the Night's Watch before a weirwood grove north of the Wall, though he grew up following the faith of the Seven. It showed that even outsiders acknowledged the significance of the old gods, and during a clash of kings, the faith in the old gods became a source of hope, as the Great John believed that it was the old gods who sent direwolves to Ned's children. Moreover, Lord John Umber claimed that the Red Comet was a sign of vengeance from the old gods for the unfair execution of Ned Stark. Similarly, the survivors of the Battle of Oxcross believed that Robb Stark marched with the support of the old gods themselves. See, whether these beliefs were true or not had never been confirmed, but they did demonstrate how deeply the religion was embedded in Westeros. And who better than Bran Stark to prove it? No, I still cannot make peace with him being the king at the end of the series and hope Martin will fix the wrongs. But when it comes to defining the religion of the old gods, Bran's journey beyond the wall began unraveling the deeper mysteries behind the religion. But now that we know about the old gods, everything makes a lot more sense. The three-eyed crow, Bran learning about the green seers resting within the roots of the weirwood trees, and suddenly, these don't seem like myths anymore. Martin, being Martin though, did not spoon-feed all the answers, but he gave enough hints to realize that the old gods might be greater than just stories passed down through generations. Fun fact, even when new religions were spreading across Westeros, their followers had to recognize the essence of the old gods, because when Melisandre wanted the free folk to submit to Stannis, she knew the importance of weirwood trees and wanted to burn them as a sign that they were accepting R'hllor. In Fire and Blood, Martin notes that some noble houses, such as House Blackwood, follow the old gods. He also describes northern warriors, often called the Northmen or Winter Wolves, fighting under the Old God's banner during the Dance of the Dragons. Additionally, Queen Alysanne Targaryen encountered followers of the Old Gods when she flew north aboard her dragon, Silverwing. Honestly, we can't tell for sure whether Martin penned the concept of Old Gods as genuinely divine beings or some different entity altogether, but it's impossible to ignore their influence on the history of Westeros. Alright guys, that's all for today. I've always disliked history back in school, but now it seems the textbooks just didn't have stories as fascinating as this. Anyway, I hope I can make some history haters love Westeros' ancient tales, and if you like this video, let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, don't forget to hit that bell icon. We'll see you in the next one. Bye!